In the last module, we covered the first two of the four base clauses that Alvin considers and rejects: indubitability and self-evidence. Now we're going to turn our attention in this module to self-presentation and then to incorrigibility. Our next clause is self-presenting. We might define self-presenting as follows. Proposition P is self-presenting if and only if, necessarily, for any S and any T. If P is true for S at T, then S believes P at T. If we use that understanding of self-presenting, then our third candidate base clause is if P is a self-presenting proposition and P is true for S at T and S believes P at T, then S's belief in P at T is justified. Alvin offers up two interpretations of self-presenting. Either A, self-presenting is an epistemic term, in other words, it presents its evidence, or we'll need to offer an alternative definition of self-presenting in terms of the kind of necessity that would help us understand it in a non-epistemic fashion, but which nevertheless would allow us to see it as giving us justification. So let's look at our first candidate clause here. It defines self-presentation in terms of nomological necessity. So 3n says, a proposition is self-presenting, just in case it is nomologically necessary that if P, that proposition, is true for S at T, then S believes P at T. Now, I'm not sure I understand Alvin's objection to this principle, and I'm definitely sure I don't understand why he thinks his objection to the principle actually undermines its epistemic status. Why is that? Well, I'll read this objection, and then I'll talk about what I think is wrong with this whole case. For example, we can imagine that a brain surgeon operating on S artificially induces a brain state B. This results phenomenologically in S suddenly believing out of the blue that he is in brain state B without any relevant antecedent beliefs. We would hardly say that in such a case that S's belief that he is in brain state B is justified. So here's the difficulty. 3n seems to define self-presentation by creating a law-like connection, and nomically necessary connection between the truth of some proposition and your believing it, so that when that proposition is true, you believe it. Now that sounds a lot like a reliable belief-forming mechanism, which is what Alvin says he wants. So I'm not sure why he thinks this particular principle or characterization thereof is bad. As a principle, I definitely don't understand why his objection is supposed to be telling against it. His objection says you would just be believing things out of the blue. You would have beliefs, but you wouldn't have access to the fact that you're justified or even be able to offer up those reasons. But at the very beginning of the paper, he says that he has a view that you would not be justified simply because you would not know you were. He says there must be some justification conferring process or properties, but this does not imply that there must be an argument or reason or anything else possessed at the time of belief by the believer. And that seems to be the exact nature of the objection. So 3n seems to be this principle that says, suppose self-presentation is just reliable belief-forming process. Then I object to it. Why? Well, because it satisfies my criterion that there is some justification conferring process or property, but that I don't have any argument or reason or anything else possessed at the time I come to believe the belief. So it seems perfectly consistent with everything that he said and the view he professes to want to advocate. So I'm puzzled, I have to admit. What about that fourth and final base clause candidate? Our final base clause candidate is given to us in the form of incorrigibility. Now, Goldman tells us that incorrigibility can be understood as follows. Proposition P is incorrigible if and only if, necessarily, for any subject and any time, if S believes that proposition at that time, then that proposition is true for that subject at that time. And this yields our fourth and final base clause candidate for this first half of the paper. If P is an incorrigible proposition and S believes P at T, then S's belief in P at T is justified. Now Alvin goes on to spell out both a nomologically necessary version of 4 and a logically necessary version of 4, and he responds to all these versions in roughly the same way he does with the versions of 3. Specifically, it takes the form of something like this quotation. Why should the fact that S's believing P guarantees the truth of P imply that S's belief is justified? The nature of the guarantee might be wholly fortuitous, as the belief state, brain state example is intended to illustrate. As I say, I'm not really sure I follow the belief state, brain state example, but what I think Alvin is trying to get at is hearkening back to the Gettier type cases. He's thinking to himself, look, it's not just enough that our belief is true. It's not even just enough that our belief is regularly true. What we really need to do is understand how it is that we're connected to the world in a way that facilitates that creation of true beliefs in a systematic way, and not just some stipulative statement or some unexplainable property. We don't want that normative virtue. We want to understand it clearly and distinctly. So in the next lecture module, we're going to switch gears again. We're going to start looking at Alvin's positive theory, and we'll see if we can find the clues for how he wants to understand that positive systematic connection that helps us to understand the relationship and thereby gain insight into justification.